Thank you very much for having come to this panel. We appreciate your presence here. We know it was a tough decision with all the competition and all the panels going on at the same time. So I'm very pleased to see so many of you interested in the field of audiovisual translation. My name is Jorge DIAZ-CINTAS, and I work at the University College London, but I'm also part of LIND, the language industry expert group at the European Union, at the DGT. We're going to be tackling today an area that was mentioned at the very beginning by in the introduction by Commissioner Oettinger about digital communication, which funnily enough hasn't been really fully discussed in other areas, in other panels that we've seen here. We've been surrounded by screens ever since we arrived. Things happening all over the place, even to a large extent simulacrums of subtitling, little text appearing everywhere, but nobody quite managed to get involved in that area. So we're going to try and look at those particular fields. I'm also aware that we are streaming to the world, and we want to be reaching people with different languages and so on. Sadly, one of the points that we're missing here as well is accessibility. So some people, deaf people, for instance, won't be able to follow what we're doing because there's no subtitling available. So maybe in the future that's one area that we would like to address, and particularly given that the European Union is fairly willing to promote inclusiveness and access for everybody in all media. We've divided the session in three pretty discrete and different areas. In one area, we're going to be talking about audiovisual translation in the sense of language transfer, and in the traditional areas like subtitling, dubbing, and voiceover. And I've got a colleague, Panayota, GEORGAKOPOULOU, will be introducing that. Then we've got another area, another dimension, which will be accessibility to the media, and Diana Sanchez will be covering that area. And then in the end, we're going to have our colleague Andrew Lamborn to discuss about how technology is having an impact on both sides of the industry. So we're going to allow them to speak for about 10-15 minutes, and then after that we will have the questions, if that is okay by everybody. So to start with, we're going to listen to Panayota GEORGAKOPOULOU. She's a senior, let me say here, she's the Senior Director and Research and International Development at Deluxe Media Europe, one of the largest companies working in the field of audiovisual translation. And as I mentioned earlier on, she's going to try and concentrate on new markets, new skills, new profiles, but from the perspective of subtitling, dubbing, voiceover, and all those areas. Okay? Jutta, when you want.
Thank you, Jorge. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It is my pleasure and an honor to be asked to present here. As Jorge mentioned, I work at Deluxe, which is one of the largest multinationals in the field of film localization. I work in the R&D team, where we focus on the application of language technologies and machine learning in audiovisual translation. Oops. Sorry. So what I thought I'd talk about today is, first of all, go through what the audiovisual translation market actually is, what challenges it faces, what trends are being discerned, what are the research projects that are currently being worked on, and taking all of this into account to set the setting to talk about the actual topic of this forum, which is what skills translators need to have to be able to work in today's audiovisual translation market, and what are the new job profiles that are emerging specifically in this market. So to start with audiovisual translation, what is it? It is multimodal type of translation in that it adds dialogue, music and effects, images, and on-screen text to the translation process, and as such it can be quite challenging. And it's also multimedia because audiovisual translation text can appear anywhere, on the cinema, on TV, at home, on the internet, on any device, and also in other settings such as theaters and museums. There's lots of different types of audiovisual translation. They're generally distinguished in two broad categories. I'm sure you all know this, but I just want to cover the basics. So we have subtitling on the one hand, where text goes together, is added to speech, and we have revoicing, where speech is replacing speech in the translation process. And depending on whether we are talking about audiovisual translation for hearing and sighted audiences or not, we have in the latter cases types such as subtitles for the deaf and hard of hearing, or captions, or sign language interpreting for the deaf and hard of hearing, and also audio subtitles and audio description for the hearing impaired. And Diana will talk about all of these accessibility services later on. And also subtitles can be placed at the foot of the screen or at the very top when we talk about surtitles, and depending on how we want to replace speech with speech in the target language, we talk about the various types of revoicing, such as lip sync dubbing or voiceover narration or interpreting. So it's quite broad. And here is a slide as well that shows you a brief history of audiovisual translation and its major milestones. I won't go through it all, but basically it all started in the 40s. The first major milestone was in the 70s with the invention of Line 21 closed captioning in the States, teletext in Europe, the birth of VHS, and the first point where content started increasing significantly, and so did the need for its localization. This trend continued with cable and satellite into the 80s, and then the 90s were the second major milestone, when we had digitization and the birth of the localization industry. And developments have been a lot more rapid in our century because of constant developments in our industry and new requirements coming up, different needs. All of this has to do with the volume of content that is audiovisual content that is exploding. And I would like to say that this content is not just entertainment material. It's not just films and series that you watch on TV, for instance, or on your Netflixes and Amazon Primes and so on. It's also other types of content, such as audiovisual video lectures, for instance. Video is the primary means of communication in our century, so we have a lot more types of audiovisual content, and not just entertainment content. And also in the entertainment domain, which is where I work, it used to be the case that we had a lot of English video content that we had to translate into any language, but now we see a huge increase in content that comes from non-English source languages. So fast forward to today. I think this slide is interesting. It's actually a slide that summarizes all the Localization Services. A big language service provider in the audiovisual area offers their clients, so this is what we offer at Deluxe. And I'm pretty sure that when translators actually think of audiovisual translation, they probably just think only the line that reads subtitle translation and the other one that reads language dubbing. I don't think they really think about all the rest, but this goes to show you this, the breadth and spread of services that we're actually offering our clients. There's a lot more involved. Now, talking about our industry in general, the Common Sense Advisory tells us that the translation field has been experiencing an average annual growth rate of about 5.5% in 2015 and 2016. That means that it is a very healthy market. The expected growth rate for 2017 and 2018 is 6.5 to 7.5%. So it's an upward trend, and all of this despite the financial crisis. So specifically, the market worldwide in 2016 was worth $40 billion, and it is estimated to reach $45 billion by 2020. And Europe, we're very lucky because Europe, with its linguistic diversity and all its languages, actually accounts for over half of this worldwide translation market turnover. So we are in the best place we could possibly be. We can rejoice about that. Now, what about the audiovisual translation market specifically? Unfortunately, there are not that many studies there. The first one I could find was carried out in 2009 by the DGT. and it estimated the European, the EU, EU subtitling and dubbing market to be between 372 and 465 million euros. Now, there was another study earlier this year by MESA, which estimated the content localization, as they refer to it, market in EMEA to be at approximately 2 billion now per year, and they estimate it to be at 2.5 billion by 2020, which is a growth rate of about 8 to 10% annually. This means that not only the translation market is actually flourishing, but the audiovisual translation market specifically has a higher average growth rate than the general market in general. So we are, in audiovisual translation, we are growing much more. That means there's more jobs and more opportunities for translators in the audiovisual field. So let's talk about our market. What I've done is I've summarized the challenges that our market faces today in this slide. The first and the biggest challenge, I would say, is the volumes of content that need to be localized. These are increasing exponentially, especially in our century. They're just more and more and more. Our clients keep asking for more content to be localized. As I mentioned, this is not only English content anymore, but there's a lot more from other languages and not just English. There's lots of statistics, two interesting ones just to show how volume of content is increasing. You can think of the statistic that says 300 hours of content uploaded on YouTube by users every minute, or the statistic that says video will account for 79% of all global internet traffic by 2020. So you can understand why we're experiencing this growth in our industry. Now, on top of this, we have the usual challenges, faster turnaround times, live delivery, new markets, new formats, security issues, new technologies such as virtual reality and augmented reality, and the price pressure that everyone else is increasing. And if you take all of that into account, you can understand how difficult it is to achieve improvements in our current workflows that would address all of these challenges. So what is happening? One way to address these challenges is that workflows in audiovisual translation have become, much like the general translation industry, I would say, production-like. We cover all time zones. We distribute work equally. We increase speed and productivity. We standardize work, which makes it easier to onboard and train translators and all of our in-house staff as well. And it is translation management and content management platforms that are the key to making this possible because they allow for distributed workforces. Another major trend that has emerged in our industry is crowdsourcing. We have had crowdsourcing, fund subbing to be exact, since the 90s. It's more common today, and now we even have fund dubbing. And all of these communities of fund subbers and fund dubbers have their audiences, have their own fans who want to actually use those subtitles and dubs to such an extent that the other day, very high-profile content client of ours was telling me that they're actually engaging the services of the fund dubber that was dubbing their content illegally into Russian, and now they're going to, use them because, apparently he has a following. And when we think about crowdsourcing, we should also think about types of material that is not just for entertainment purposes. Today, 1 or 2 days ago, I can't remember, I was reading an article that the Sikh in the United Arab Emirates has just begun a project whereby he's going to crowdsource the translation of 5,000 academic videos on math and science into Arabic for accessibility, right? Now, apart from crowdsourcing, the other major trend in our industry that Andrew will talk to you about is the application of language technologies. We have had language technologies applied in the audiovisual translation industry more or less since the turn of the century, and mainly for accessibility purposes. So we have applications of text-to-speech for the visually impaired, in electronic program guides, in audio subtitles and audio description, and we have applications of speech-to-text through revoicing, for live subtitles and captions, again for the hearing impaired. And the last technology that's being fit for size in our industry is actually machine translation and CAT tools, which is the area that my team's actually working on right now. Just to show you what's happening at the European level, all of these trends, of course, are followed closely by Europe. And with European Commission Research and Innovation funding, there's lots of projects that are researching all of these developments. The ones that you see, the projects that you see on the screen, specifically relate to the application of language technologies, whether speech recognition or machine translation, into subtitles of various domains, whether entertainment domain subtitles, news, sports, debates, weather forecasts, academic videos, MOOCs, but it's all about subtitles. I've had the pleasure personally of actually participating in most of these projects, so I've actually seen the results of applying experimentally in these projects language technologies in subtitling, and I was very pleased with the results. On the topic of crowdsourcing as well, there's also projects on that relate to crowdsourcing to one extent or the other. You saw the Tramuk project mentioned in the previous slide as well. It does not only research the application of machine translation in academic videos, in MOOCs, it also researches crowdsourcing strategies in translation workflows. And funding has also been awarded to smaller projects that also deal with crowdsourcing, such as, for instance, Subtitle X is a project that's looking to increase the circulation of European audiovisual works, or Suburbia.eu aims at building a portal for crowdsourcing subtitling. Working Subtitle has to do with the distribution of film to VOD platforms, and Sinando and ST has to do with building a crowdsourcing, a networking platform for film professionals. So the EU is on top of everything. I'm very pleased to report. Now, moving on, I would like to take all of this into consideration and try to answer the main question of this forum, which is, what are the skills that translators need to have in today's market? What are the new job profiles that are emerging as a result of all of these developments that we just talked about? I thought I'd start with a list of the translations of the positions that we currently have in my company, where we typically employ linguists. As you can see, you have the translator position. I mentioned it as translation tasks, so basically that's the translator role there. We hire translators, of course, mainly freelance, sometimes in-house as well. And that is where translation tasks are, of course, translation skills are, of course, most in demand. However, in all of the other positions that you also see, language skills are required as well and used to some extent or another. So you have positions like project coordination, where, of course, project management skills is the core skill that you need in a staff member in that position. But you also want them to know what translation is, because it is translation projects that they will be coordinating. The same for quality assurance, tech services, and so on. And we also encourage internships and work placements, because we think this is one of the best ways to train our prospective employers in the specific needs of our company. And actually, the employment rate of our interns is very near 100%, because we typically offer all of our interns either freelance or in-house work after they finish their work placements with us, and that's if they're not already snatched by our competition, because our scheme is quite popular. At the same time, because of the developments that we talked about. There are a number of new job profiles that are emerging in the market, and some of them have already been mentioned today, earlier, or yesterday in this forum. So Jaap, for instance, talked about data analysts, and Sabrina talked about translation technology experts, or we heard about machine translation consultants earlier on. So in the audiovisual translation market, of course, we have some profiles that are existing ones. These ones are existing ones, but they are fairly new, and they have come about as a result of the needs of our industry, what our clients ask, and developments in the industry. And then there's others that are potential and they could emerge as a result of the use of new technologies. These are all job profiles that I put together like three years ago, I think, for a presentation to my executive management when I was talking to them what's happening in our market and what could happen as a result of language technology. So these were all guesses of mine at the time. Now, in order to answer the question about the skills of the translator, I think it's very useful to look at the broader distinction, as we have done earlier in this forum, of what are the various types of roles that a translator is asked to fulfill in the translation market. Moravia have done this successfully in one of their blogs, so I decided to just summarize what they said instead of trying to reinvent the wheel. So translators are, of course, as you know, they are in charge of multilingual communication, and they are also the custodians of the grammar of their language. This is what translators have always been and will always be. Now, when translators deal with things with text like advertisement copy or highly branded material, where the intent of the translation is to generate the same feelings, the same emotions in the target audience as in the source, then we talk about transcreation. Copy and transcreation is also another term that has been mentioned quite a lot in this forum. And a step above transcreation is copywriting, where the materials are created directly in the target language. There is no source. Even more further removed from the translation process, again, something that I was very pleased to hear in this forum, is consulting, cultural consulting, which is basically guidance for the client in terms of the motivation and the behavior of the target buyers. And as much as this may sound strange, and maybe it doesn't anymore after all the times people have spoken about it, these are typically roles that are filled by translators, this role. So it's translators that do this job. And of course, what we've been talking about for those two days non-stop almost, the largest increase in terms of the jobs that are coming ahead is that of a post-editor, not just of machine translation, but also of speech recognition output, I would say. So the person that reviews and amends machine translation or speech recognition output to the quality level that the client wants. And this is the job profile with the highest growth, with the highest expected growth, and therefore, as such, it constitutes an opportunity for translators. But where does subtitling and dubbing fit in all of this? All we have to do is ask, what is the intent? So when we talk about entertainment material, films, for instance, the intent is to generate the same emotions in the target audience as the source, which is what? To entertain. Therefore, in that sense, one would say that there's a lot of affinity between subtitling and dubbing and transcreation. But when it comes to other types of audiovisual material, like informative content, training, educational videos, the intent there is to train, to educate, to inform. Then we see cases where the application of language technologies has been happening a lot faster. Now, back to our original question, what are the skills? We've been talking about these skills for 2 days. About a month ago, I attended the first conference of professional translators and interpreters in Greece. These are my notes from that conference. These are the things that translators thought. These are the skills that translators themselves thought from professional organizations in Greece, thought they need to have. And they're very much the same as what has been talked about in these past 2 days. Of course, language skills and subject matter expertise are always in fashion. But people spend a lot of time talking a lot about general transferable skills, such as research skills and soft skills and curiosity, like we did earlier on today, and the openness to change and the willingness to learn new things, especially when it comes to technology. So I thought I'd ask the same question. I'd pose the same question to Deluxe staff, the 1,500 localization employees in my company. So I just posted this question about the skills translators need to have on our localization all chat room, and here are the responses that I've got. I've grouped them together in 4 categories to make it easier. Of course, the first lot of comments has to do, again, with language skills, with accurately conveying the meaning of the and the intent of the original of the author in the target language, and of course in these answers we had a lot of answers that were had to do with specific audiovisual translation requirements, such as the ability to condense text in subtitling, or my personal favorite, eye for detail and ear for tone. Then there was another lot of answers that had to do with more general skills that translators need to have, such as, we talked about it already, curiosity, creativity, general knowledge, willingness to learn, cultural awareness, willingness to develop themselves, and to that effect, people talked specifically, repeatedly, about technology and the need to embrace it. And finally, there were a lot of answers that had to do with transferable skills that are true of other professions as well, especially of people that are self-employed professionals, because translators typically are. You can see a lot of answers to that effect. Our translation resources team that's in charge of our translators stressed really aspects such as professionalism, understanding on the client service provider relationship, and so on. And a lot of people also pointed out things like opportunities for translators to work in other positions in the translation industry, such as project coordination, QA, and so on. So if I had to just summarize it all, last slide, and give what I heard in this forum as well, and all of that I've just talked about, I would say that the overarching conclusion is a back to basics trend. There are so many developments happening in the industry, so many new tools that come out almost every day, that it would be impossible for universities to actually teach all of them to their students. So really what they need to do and keep doing is make their students, teach them how to research, how to learn for themselves, because this is what they will be doing in their professional career. They will be learning these new tools by themselves, and also make them aware, and that is maybe the element that universities were not doing as much in my time at university, but maybe they're doing more today, is make students aware of all the skills that are needed and lead to a successful career that are not language skills. I would like to close with a statement that I heard from Hernley Liu, the 13th FIT president, at the conference I mentioned earlier on. He said, broader education makes you adaptive and flexible, where a specialization could lead to low re-employment. And, you know, it's not all about language skills. There's a lot of other skills, so work on those soft skills. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jota, for such an interesting presentation, and we move swiftly to the second speaker. Diana Sanchez works as a global engagement manager for access services at Ericsson Broadcast and Media Services. And as I mentioned earlier on, she's going to be concentrating a lot more on access service for people with sensory disabilities. Could I also, I'm sorry, some people at the end, you might be finding trouble to read the transparencies and the slides. We were told that there was going to be a fourth screen at the end so that people can see it. So if that could be done, so you will be in a better position to see the material.
Oh, we're getting the extra screen. Thank you. Hello. Morning, everybody. Thank you, firstly, for the invite. I'm honoured to be here. As Jorge said, I work for EBMS, Ericsson Broadcast and Media Services. Some of you might be more familiar with the company as Red Bee Media, which was the company that was bought by Ericsson a few years ago. I just wanted to take a show of hands. How many people are aware of Access Services, how, for example, live subtitles are produced? How many people? Okay, so not very many. Okay. In Ericsson Access Services, we employ, I'd say, an awful lot of people with a language services background, graduates in languages, translation graduates. Often they're using their target language or their native language a lot more than their translation skills, but we do employ a lot of linguists. What I'm going to talk to you today about, if I can get this to work, I'm just going to give you a really brief overview of what we do in Ericsson, in Access Services. I'm going to talk a bit about what's going on in the world of television and how that's transforming, because I think that affects us all. What the trends are that are coming out of that, and what new profiles we're seeing being created from that in our industry. So what do? We used to be BBC Broadcast, so we do the subtitles for the deaf and hard of hearing on television for most of the UK channels, except the ones that Deluxe do. And what does that mean? We do live subtitles, pre-recorded subtitles, audio description for people with visual impairment. We have sign language translators, and we also do some localization. We also recently are being asked more and more to do interlingual live subtitling as well. Our core business is intralingual live subtitling for broadcasters. We have offices all over the place. We've got about 600 people, staff within the Access Services part of Ericsson Broadcast and Media, and we're present in 7 countries. So we're in the UK, Spain, the Netherlands, France, Canada, Atlanta in the US, and in Australia we're in Sydney and Melbourne. And what we do is lots and lots of subtitling, lots of live subtitling in 4 languages, French, Spanish, English and Dutch, lots and lots of pre-recorded subtitling, and audio description and sign language, obviously, as well. And who do we do it for? Most of the broadcasters, the top-tier broadcasters in the countries where we're present, so a lot of these will be familiar to you. And I thought to just give you a bit of an overview, I'd show a video. Unfortunately, QuickTime doesn't seem to work here, so I'm going to have to just go out if you'll bear with me.
You asked me, what it's like, what it feels like when you're faced with that sort of challenge, and it's exciting. It's kind of why you get up in the morning for the job.
Paralympics 2016 Rio.
Channel 4 came to us with a particular challenge, which was to make the Paralympics the first totally accessible Paralympics that they'd ever done.
We wanted to do live signing, we wanted to do live audio description and live subtitles. We wanted to go in areas that other broadcasters can't go, and they said yes.
Is that a big deal?
It's a huge deal. We haven't done that before.
It meant getting in new technology. In this case, we were pulling in some new technology from the States, and it also meant people learning new skills.
As all the Paralympic athletes were finalising their training and striving for glory, we were training but in a very different way.
Because it was the year of the disabled, Channel 4 said, actually, we want a deaf translator. We don't want to have a hearing interpreter. The number one thing in my mind was preparation.
We had done a lot of research and prep over the summer. We'd done rehearsals.
What it means when you're doing it live, of course, is that there's no going back. There's no re-recording it. You have to get everything right first time.
I was in the Channel 4 building, crossing my fingers.
And when it came to the hour, as all the athletes are limbering up, waiting for that starting gun, over 5,000 miles away.
The stadium's absolutely packed.
Ready to press the on-air button and go live. And when I say live, I mean live.
A wheelchair stuntman launches himself down the ramp, and spectators continue to stand, cheering and waving across the Maracanã.
We did it. I think we did it really well.
We were the first in the world. It's never happened before.
Really proud of the fact that Channel 4 did it first, and Ericsson helped us do that. Job well done.
And would you do it again?
Of course we'd do it again, yeah.
So there were two new profiles there.
Thank you.
For us. Oh,
Please, thank you very much.
we get rid of the auto.
President Park.
Got a bit of Barack Obama there. Like he was thanking me. Thanks. Oh. So there were two main new profiles there that we needed in order to do that. One was the live audio description. So that was someone who was able to produce that audio description live. Yeah? So if you think about that, thinking about what's relevant for blind people and describing that content live is a pretty specific skill. And the other was the live deaf translators. So we try to use deaf translators wherever possible because obviously that's their first language, so you always translate into your native tongue. In this case, obviously for live, it's quite difficult to do that. What we did was we took the live subtitle stream and put that through auto cue so that our deaf translators could read the subtitles and then translate. So those were two of the sort of new innovative services that we began for the Paralympics. So just briefly, and I'm aware that we're a bit stuck for time, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I think we're all more or less aware of what's going on in telly. You know, we've got Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, vast amounts of content, yeah? Volumes, as Jutta said, are growing exponentially, and that's combined with really shorter delivery windows. So we're having to do a lot more and a lot quicker. In terms of behaviour, and this is also having an impact on how we do our job and what job we need to do, we're seeing on-demand content soaring, especially I think 16 to 19-year-olds watch over half of the content that they watch on demand. We're seeing binge viewing. You know, we all want to watch the whole of a series, don't we? We don't want to watch one and wait a week and watch the next one. So that is also affecting our industry because we need to then changed from being schedule-driven to being driven by when the content arrives to us, getting it done as fast as possible, getting all of the episodes of that series done quickly and consistently and coherently. So that's also affecting our industry. Piracy, as always, is also something that we have to bear in mind and is affecting our industry. Number of the amount of content being watched on mobile, on device, different formats, different devices, that's affecting us because we're having to produce all of these different formats, all of these different conversions, so that you can watch that video on your iPhone, or you can watch it on your laptop or your tablet, and the subtitles always come out perfectly. We're also seeing changes in business models. We're seeing traditional broadcasters who would have had, say, schedules of pre-recorded content are looking at live events more. So there's an increase in that, and you're seeing it with the football and the rights for the football, how those are skyrocketing in terms of how much they're costing. Everyone wants a live event. Content discovery, which I'll touch on briefly later, is also really important. We've seen that people are spending a lot more time trying to find the content that they want to watch. And that affects our industry because we need to produce the metadata so that that experience works. And I think another thing that's really interesting about what's going on is that there's a prediction that we've gone from sitting on our sofas like couch potatoes, watching telly together and talking about what we're watching, to watching it on our own in our bedrooms, on our mobiles, or on the tube. And the prediction is that with virtual reality, that social aspect of watching television will come back. So I think that there will be also new profiles in how do we make that virtual reality accessible for people with sensorial disabilities. The main trends, they're all driven by this change. So content security, I don't know whether you've heard, we had films stolen and held to ransom recently. We've had script leaks of really high profile content. It's becoming really, really important. It always has been, but even more so now. With cloud platforms, it's good because they're far more secure. But that they need to have a level of authentication which is really high, and I'm sure Andrew will go into that more. We're also seeing more global platforms, people working on global platforms, workflows are changing, there's a lot of sharing going on. We have a follow the sun model, so for example, the subtitles that we produce for the BBC overnight, for BBC News, are produced from Australia. Yeah, so we follow the sun and the people are in the place where they're awake. The gig economy, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about this over the 2 days, but yeah, we're seeing increased use of freelancers, increased use of crowdsourcing, micropayments. These are all the trends that are affecting our industry. And of course, automation. You've talked a lot about MT, but it's also, as Jutta said, affecting it's really important within intralingual subtitling. So we're constantly looking at the ASR that's out there and evaluating it and incorporating it when it's fit for purpose. So ASR's improved as MT has, and everybody's been talking about due to deep learning approaches recently. It's really getting a lot better. It's still not, you can't just plug it in and have perfect live subtitles. But it is at a stage where it can be, it's being used in offline production with post-editing, which has also been like the favourite word of this conference. So what are the new profiles that we're seeing? As I said, we've got the live AD profile, live signing, live interlingual, so that's an interpreting. So interpreters who are then taught to re-speak so that they can produce the live subtitles with speech recognition. Correctors, post-editors. We're getting a lot more home workers. a lot of, internet speeds now mean that you can do almost any job from home. A lot of remote and mobile working, a lot of virtual teams. And the skills that those freelancers need, really, apart from being excellent linguists and good at their language and having all the skills to produce the subtitles or the audio description, they need decent business acumen. They need to have basic accountancy skills. They need to be able to market themselves. And we're also increasingly seeing that the subtitler profile and the metadata editor profile are also sort of merging. So while producing subtitles for a live sports program, for example, a subtitler could also be tagging that sports program with metadata, signalling when there was a goal or a red card or whatever, enriching captioning so that you have links within the captions, metadata tags, linking out so that people can navigate out and learn more about certain concepts within things. So there's a lot more to it than just being able to re-speak or to type. And that was what I had to say.
And we move now to the last speaker of the session, Andrew Lambourne. He is currently a professor at the School of Computing, Creative Technology and Engineering at Leeds, Beckett University in England, in Britain. But he's been working for many years in the field of access services and is one of the pioneering people working in this field in the UK and beyond. Andrew.
Thank you very much, Jorge, and thank you everybody for coming to our session. I've actually decided to dispense with my slides, which is probably a horror story for the good people who are working in the booths here, because they've been obviously preparing their work based on what I had given them in advance. Whereas, to use a colloquial expression, I've decided to fly by the seat of my pants. And I see already the signs coming from the booth saying, no, this is not necessarily what we want you to do. But actually, if I speak slowly, I'm sure they'll be fantastically capable of coping. And I think before we go any further, we should all acknowledge the services which these people have given us throughout this conference. I'm just going to listen in to what's going on now in the booths. Aha, they're saying, who is this crazy Englishman? Send him to the guillotine, which I give you an opportunity to say that here in the EU, something you may want to say as a result of recent events. Anyway, coming back to the subject at hand, and audiovisual translation and the use of technology, and the humans that are involved in it, and the way in which, and this is something which I've been researching for my entire career as not only a researcher but also a technology developer, what fascinates me is the partnership between people and computers and how the balance of tasks has changed over the years. When I first started, and this was 37 years ago, it used to take 40 hours of work, that's a whole week of work, for a subtitler working in SDH, subtitling for deaf and hard of hearing people, to prepare the subtitles for just 1 hour of a TV program. That's a whole week of work. And throughout my career, I've been trying to help move this forwards so that ratio reduces. And I don't dare quote what it is now, because it depends actually so much on the genre, whether you have a script. We've got it so finely tuned, you could possibly do it in less than 5 hours of work now. So that's a factor of 8 at least improvement in the productivity there. Does that mean that subtitlers are now devalued or valueless, that they're subservient to the machines, or does it mean that they're empowered and that they're actually spending less time on the drudge? In the early days, they were messing around with complicated videotape machines that weighed a ton and were about this big. Now you can just click a mouse and move instantly through a digital media file. So are people now empowered? Are they able to focus on the real key skills that the human can bring and use the machine for the tedious bits in the background. I think they are, and I think if we look at it in that positive way, it helps us moving forwards. So audiovisual translation is a form of translation that broadens things from just literally language translating of documents. And what we're doing there is we're actually taking pictures and sound which have been carefully crafted to give an enjoyable artistic media experience, and we have to retranslate that experience for the benefit of, first of all, the deaf and hard of hearing viewers into an experience of pictures and texts, perhaps backed up by some residual hearing. And this is a complicated process. It's something which is an art form. It's not just a scientific process. And then when we have a blind or partially sighted person wishing also to access a television broadcast, we have to provide something which describes what's going on in the gaps between the dialogue and perhaps the muzak that often plays in the background of programs. So when I was doing this earlier on, that would mean nothing to a blind or partially sighted person unless the audio describer said he's making chopping motions at his throat. So this is the sort of thing which, if you like, opens up broadcasts to people who are separated from accessing not just by, or not only by, or not even by a language barrier, but by a sensory barrier too. The evolution of the technologies in these different spaces have actually been in parallel. And in AVT, we use a wider range of technologies. Another reason I tore up my slides was because Diana had stolen a lot of my thunder, but never mind, I'll forgive her. She's introduced us in a fantastic way to the range of technology which is used. For example, it's not just technologies for transcribing speech. There are technologies where if you have an audio file for a program and you have a script for the program, a technology called a speech follower can put those two together, and it can tell you the timing at which each part of that script was spoken. So you could conceive of feeding this information into a black box and back comes subtitles. You could even conceive of the system identifying the different speakers and colouring the subtitles appropriately. You can conceive of a system where it's looking at the pictures and deciding who's standing where and moving the subtitles around the screen beneath the person who's speaking. There are certainly systems which identify the shot changes, the picture cuts in the media files and make sure the subtitles don't overlap them. So there's a whole range of different technologies which go towards the task of synthesizing something new to represent this media content in an additional and supplementary way. And at the moment, at least, and I think it will be the case for many years to come, the human mediator, the human is making the key decisions, drawing together this information, deciding on whether, for example, the program is even worth feeding into a speech transcription engine. Why may it not be worth feeding it in? Well, if you have your typical, I don't know, magazine entertainment program, you find more and more these days that the dialogue is being masked by music which is running beneath it. You can't necessarily get a clean feed of audio. And so therefore it's quite difficult for a computer to separate out the sound of the person speaking from the sound of the musical underlying it, which of course makes it harder for deaf people to follow the program in the first instance, but the program producers don't always think of that. So we have to deal with the different genres, the different styles, the different artistic content in our material and deploy our technologies accordingly. And that's where the decisions need to be made in the workflow process, and those decisions are often best made by the human beings. So we have parallels in some ways in which the technologies are used. We have parallels in which these technologies have evolved. If you think about the ways in which we've been talking during this conference, the plundering of big data, our data, the data that the humans have produced in order to create machines which can do a plausibly similar job of translation. And exactly the same goes on when you're talking about machines which can do a plausible job of transcribing. So if I was speaking into a speech recognition system which I had trained to my voice, my utterances, my way of pronouncing vowels, I could get probably 99.5% accuracy as a result of doing that training. If I'm feeding in the voices of anybody in this room, the accuracy level will drop substantially because it's not trained to your specific way of speaking. But nevertheless, it's still becoming more and more impressive over time. So it's not so much a matter of what these things can do. It's important to actually begin to understand what it is they can't do. Where do they fail? Where do these machines fall down? Having looked at all of our data, this is the information which humans have produced. Humans have done the translations of the material which these big engines are now looking at and are now searching. Humans have created the transcripts of speech which the machines are now using to create their own capability. All they're doing is they're really distilling out the essence of what we've done that's clever. And they do it in such a way that it's in neural-based systems a kind of pattern recognition where you feed in then something and the essence of what they've distilled from our work and our endeavour over millions and millions of examples is used to create something that looks plausible by way of an output. But that output isn't going to be perfect, and when they fail in rather stupid ways. And one of the things I've been looking at is when you're dealing with live subtitling and this process which Diana described of re-speaking. You listen to a television program, you re-say the dialogue into a computer, carefully trained to your voice. Yes, it's 99% accurate, but it will fail, and it does fail, and it fails in spectacularly stupid ways. And some of the ways it fails are due to the phonetic ambiguity inherent in language. So we're not just dealing with sounds when we listen to language, we're dealing with things on a number of different levels. For example, quite often at least, when I'm speaking, I'm actually conveying something which is a meaningful discourse. It sort of changes as you go on later into the evening, but nevertheless, we are engaged in a process whereby I'm seeking to convey something to you which has meaning. Now, to a transcription system, it has absolutely no concept of that meaning. It is simply listening to the audio patterns and producing the most plausible hypothesis as to what it is that I have spoken if it were to be transcribed. But it can transcribe that in a completely meaningless way. So if there were noise in the room that was interfering with your hearing of what I'm saying, you would still be able to follow because you would use the context, you would use the meaning, you would use extra clues. You would be reading my lips, perhaps, if I started to mumble or the microphone gave out. You'd be using a much richer means of accessing, and you'd be basing that on your understanding of and your following of the thread of discourse. Fortunately for us at the moment, they haven't caught up with that yet. So the machines don't have knowledge of meaning. They don't understand the thread of the course of a conversation. They don't understand the nuances of the cultural differences in producing a translation. So I confidently predict that humans will still be required in 5 years' time, and hopefully for a lot longer than that, because of the fact that these tasks we're dealing with, when it really comes down to it, and they talk about artificial intelligence, actually it's not artificial intelligence, it's simulated intelligence. And the tasks that you and I do are the really intelligent tasks, and those are the tasks where, although maybe the iceberg is shrinking slightly that we're standing on, those are the tasks where the human skills are still required. So if we're looking forward into the future, what I think we're looking at is to identify the ways in which humans still have the edge and the human understanding of the bigger picture is still important. And I mean, Diana alluded to this in one of the things she said. Having a business awareness, having an understanding of the big picture, having an understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of these tools. So for the people who are coming through the education system now, I would be saying, don't be afraid of them. Understand how they work. By understanding how they work and how they're developed and how they're designed, understand their fundamental weaknesses, understand their fundamental limitations. By all means, deploy them, use them. They are tools. They're subservient to you. They're not going to destroy you. Use them as tools. If you go back to your colleges, don't go back and say, oh, please help me, tell me more. Go back and say, if you had taught me this, I would have been more effective in my career. So we need to be thinking of ourselves always and only as the masters of these tools, using them in ways which help us by avoiding the things that we would rather not have to do and focusing more and more on the things that are hardest to do. Now, I've got a whole heap of bits of paper here where I'd scribbled down the thoughts that I wanted to put into my talk today, but I think, and the one's even hit the floor now, I think to summarise, develop the ability to be pragmatic. Don't feel threatened by these things. Be pragmatic, see where they fit, use them. Be aware that fundamentally what we're doing here is all part of a business. Businesses like to make money. How are they going to make money? Most effectively by balancing the human and the computer resources. Choose the work for which the humans are best suited, choose the work for which the machines are best suited, and make sure that the appropriate member of that partnership is doing appropriate work, and build the understanding that you have of how these things are evolving, where they're going, and what part you want to play in the future. I wish you all the very best, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you very much to the two other speakers for such illuminating presentations and also complimentary. I'm pretty aware of the time, and I didn't want to make this just a discussion from this angle of the room, so I'm quite happy to open the floor for any questions that you may have that you want to address to the speakers. I can see already one hand at the end there.
Oui, je vais un petit peu reposer.
Good afternoon. I'm going to give the French booth a bit of a rest. We don't talk often enough about the deterioration of the market for AV translators. The situation in France is pretty disastrous, certainly. First of all, because the number of those providing services or offering, say, dubbing and subtitling services has increased greatly. So this means that the translators don't have any contact with, say, the television channels that they work for. There's always an intermediary, and that makes it very, very difficult to negotiate decent tariffs as well, which means that the prices have fallen significantly. And basically, there's been a lot of training for AV translators. A lot of young people have been attracted by this because they're attracted by the idea of fan dubbing and so on, and they think it might be a useful profession for them. In addition to that, in France, there is the issue of copyrights for subtitling work. In other words, translators who have made this their profession, they are in a company which is responsible for the distribution of copyrights. However, the problem with this system is that you've now got a number of service providers who order translation from the subtitling translators, but they keep the copyright rights in their pockets themselves, and basically they don't want to tell beginners that they may have the right to copyright on their own work themselves. Now, I don't know if that's similar to what you've got in other countries, but I'm just wondering what we could do about that kind of thing at European level.
Thank you very much for the question. If I might just add a little bit, I wouldn't like the conversation to go around the same topic and fees and rates. France has got a very strong association, the ATA, which is working in this field, and there is also an international association at the European level called AVTE that is also working in this respect. So there is a lot of new developments in that field. But I would allow any of my colleagues here that would like to address the question.
Hello, thank you for the question. I would like to try to address it at least. When you mentioned about providers, a larger number of providers available, more content, more jobs, so that translators don't end up getting in touch with the end clients, I would say to some extent this might be true because of that slide, if you remember in my presentation, of the types of services that we offer are clients. So when clients do require all those services, it goes without saying that they will come to companies like us to provide them, and they will not be able to go to individual translators. There are other types of clients, though, such as Netflix, for instance, who for some of their content, not all of it, certainly the least of it, but still they are in a position to contact individual translators, and for this they have launched the Hermes test. I think a lot of people in the translation community are aware of it. You can self-register with Netflix, take a test, take their test, pass it successfully, hopefully, and then maybe Netflix will use you directly, and then you can try to negotiate your own rates with them. As I would say, you can try to negotiate them with any language service provider. Certainly in all the companies that I've worked with, people are paid differently. There's not a flat rate for all French translators. They're paid differently depending on their skills and their expertise. And as in every profession, translators that just join the market and have no experience shouldn't really be, have the expectation to be paid like someone with 20 years experience. Also, even if you don't think of the experience, not all translators deliver the same at the end of the day, and this is also something that you can negotiate in your fee. If you are really that brilliant translator, I'm sure you would negotiate high fees. I know many brilliant translators that do. On the subject of copyright, that this is a really tricky topic. I think it's a misconception that LSPs keep the copyright for themselves. They don't. We actually pass it on to our clients. We are required to pass it on to our clients. We have this, in our case, for instance, we have these clauses in our agreements because the agreements we sign with our clients say that anything that we produce for them will be owned by them. Therefore, we're obliged legally to pass on these terms to all of our staff, in-house or freelance. I know copyright is a tough subject. I don't think there is very specific legislation. I recently asked that very question myself at that conference I mentioned about a month ago, and Henry Liu was kind enough to actually provide with the answer that in Europe, I think it's only in Spain that there is legislation protecting the copyright of translators, but it's not enforced because there's no practical way of enforcing. So I'm afraid I don't have an answer for you, but I would like to dispel that misconception that LSPs just keep the copyright for themselves. That's just not true. The content owners, the ones that own the content, they are the ones that demand to keep the copyright. And in a sense, I personally think that's kind of fair. I mean, they are hiring our services for their content, so whatever we produce on their content should really be theirs. I don't know.
Do we have any other questions? Yeah, we've got two. I think she was faster to raise her hand.
Hi. I was just wondering, to what extent would you encourage people, so either students or translators wishing to move into the field of audiovisual translation, to follow specific courses in audiovisual translation? Because obviously with all these new technologies coming about, more and more courses are becoming available. But as Panayota mentioned, I think a lot of people are learning on the job to use subtitling tools or all kinds of different software. So my question would be, what would your advice be in terms of training? Is it better to follow a course or just learn on the job? And is it for students or professionals? What is your sort of take on that? Thank you.
It's a tough one, and it's linked to the last comment as well. There are a lot of courses now offering MAs, for example, in audiovisual translation, and they will also have modules on accessibility. Depending on the country that you live in, it might be that there are lots and lots of people who've already taken those courses and the market is saturated, which is having an effect on rates. In Spain, for example, that's the case. I know there are a number of really good courses, personally, I've employed lots of people who've completed those courses because they give you a good grounding in the basics. Then, of course, after that point, there's a lot of learning to be done on the job. But yeah, I think the MA courses that are available at the moment in audiovisual translation are a good investment. Depends a lot on your language combination.
Thank you very much. I'm a translator and sometime I do live television interpreting for the news, very sporadically, so it's last minute. I wonder if the panel could comment some of the technologies you've discussed for the audiovisual translation could be applied to not just for accessibility, but to the wider spectrum of live television interpreting. And Skype, I believe, a couple of years ago launched a product which they claimed could do direct simultaneous interpreting between, I think the pilot was between German and Japanese, and then they disappeared. I wondered if you could comment on whether those technologies are developing. Thank you.
There are always those who feel that it is possible to plug the television soundtrack into a black box and out comes something magic. And it's been tried a number of times in a number of places, and as you say, they usually disappear. Taking the two possibilities, one is a same language transcript of a live event. You have, when you deal with this as a human being, you have an awful lot of preparation in advance of that event. In particular, if it's a sporting event, which it often is, literally making sure that you have the names of the people and the participants, and that you are aware where those names might be homophonic with the ordinary words, and therefore you have a problem with case if you say, for example, in the worst possible instance, somebody called Mr. Green is playing golf and Mr. Green hits the ball onto the green, you have an awful problem. So I think this is something which is going to continue to be problematic for automated systems, coupled with the fact, of course, that when you're re-speaking, you put in the punctuation explicitly. You actually speak the punctuation, which is harder for a machine to do automatically. When you're dealing with real-time translation, you've got not only that problem of accurate transcription, but then that's compounded by the problem of trying to translate in real time and deliver something again which is correctly and sensibly punctuated. So I think at the end of the day, quality will be the test, and it is still difficult to find situations in which in a very general way, anybody's speech can be accurately transcribed sufficiently usefully for it to be a meaningful and professional service. And I think the standards of quality set by the regulators in the target territories where broadcasts are made available for deaf and hard of hearing people, the standards are now underpinning a sensible level of quality, which previously, for example, in the States, they didn't. They just said, technically, is there data? Yes, fine, tick the box. Now, the data has to be meaningful.
Hi, Sam Stevenson from Roehampton University in London. We've spoken about the demand of clients often for quicker turnarounds and lower prices. And it strikes me that maybe part of that is because audiovisual translation is considered in the post-production phase rather than the production phase of content. I was just wondering for the panel's take on how much you think audiovisual translation would benefit from being considered in the production phase and whether that's ever likely or possible. Your take on that. Thank you.
That's an easy one. It goes without saying it would benefit tremendously for being, if it was considered in the production phase. I don't know how likely it would be. I mean, it has happened on occasion, you know, with some productions, but you can probably count them with your fingers when it has happened. Whether it will be, you know, something that will be happening mainstream in the future, we can't really predict. This has to do with revenues, I suppose. So if the content owners, the content producers, keep on making profits and selling their content without taking it into account, probably they won't. That's my opinion. Generally, you know, even accessibility, it grew when it was enforced because of legislation. People knew it was going to be good, but until they were forced to, then, there wasn't so much of it, so.
Sorry, I wonder as well in that sense, the new developments that we've been discussing, like for instance, immersive reality, 3D, where then subtitles will have to be considered a priori, will have an impact, and this is something that is coming, but again, as Jota said, it's quite difficult to predict. I think we have just time for the last question, and here, yep.
Katja May von der Europäischen Kommission hier bei.
I'm from the European Commission here in DGT. I'm a translator. I've got a question to Panayota, but also to Diana. You talked about new profiles. They sound extremely interesting. But if your son or your daughter were to come to you and ask you, what sort of job should I choose? What kind of profile should I opt for if I want a decent income? If I want to make a good living, what sort of tips would you give your son or your daughter?
She does have a daughter. She's got a son.
I'll go first? Yeah. Yeah, we're just discussing this, actually. My son's 10. I keep saying I should have studied myself to be a computational linguist rather than a translator. I love translation, but if I wanted to make more money, I should have studied something to do with computers. It's not that it's not a fantastic job. Oh, sorry. It's not that it's not a great job. I love my job. But there are other jobs where you make more money. So if money is your objective, I don't know, be a doctor. Do something else. Don't do translation. It's not one of the best paid professions in the world.
I think, yeah, I would say exactly the same to my daughter, who is 7. It depends how much money you want or you need. Obviously, no one goes into audiovisual translation to make a fortune. People go into audiovisual translation because they want to be paid to watch movies, which is why I went into it in the first place. So, yeah, you're not paid. You're not going to make an absolute fortune doing this job. Accessibility. There are a lot of other reasons as well why people go into it. It depends on your value system and what makes you get up in the morning and enjoy your job. In the case of access services, knowing that you're making a difference to society also can be beneficial, I guess. But whether I'd recommend that my daughter studied translation, no comment, I think, on that one.
Okay, well, I guess one of the benefits of that is that if there is any scandal on tax havens, very few audiovisual translators will be listed, most likely. I think I can see some hands, but I'm afraid it's already past the time. We were given until 12:30 and it's 12:35, so I'm really sorry. We're going to stay here for the rest of the afternoon. If anybody wants to address any questions to our panel here. I'd like to thank again my panel for having given the presentations here, and also everybody of you for having listened so attentively and for your questions. Thank you.